let's talk a little bit about the foundations here first, and because we have gotten into U.S. foreign policy and U.S. Ability to influence the rest of the world. And we do so in a very complicated, very difficult way because we are a very complex democracy. We're a very complex republic with representative government that was intentionally set up to be very complicated. Now, if you haven't ever read the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and I really hope you have in high school or elsewhere because they're very, very short. But the things that you and I most of the time, most on our daily lives are actually affected by are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that were hard fought over, but they guarantee the very things that we take for granted, the things that you are uttering in this room, disagreement, uttering your opinions, freedom of speech, the fact that I can't stand here and shove down a religious point of view in your throats like I could or can in other countries, that you have the right to disagree, that you have the right to actually walk the streets without having the fear that the police will just randomly pick you up and take you off, like you still can in about 100 countries around the world. These first 10 amendments are actually the basis for most of the freedoms, the liberties that we take for granted today. The fact that you should be able to have your day in court if so required, that you have peers, not some unknown judges sit in judgment over you, that we have a very clear delineation between what the powers of the central government, the federal government are, and the powers that remain with the states. Now, for all of the liberties and freedoms that you have, freedom of speech, religion, carry arms and assemble and not be randomly picked up by the police and so on, equally much on a daily basis that influence us is this. The vast majority of laws that you are bound by on a daily basis are not federal. These are rights and guarantees that pertain to every individual citizen, but most of the laws that you are encountering every day are state-based. From zoning laws and traffic laws and benefits and all of these other laws that govern what we do on a daily basis, those are mostly state-based. So if you move from Pennsylvania to Ohio to California to others, they will differ. And the fact that you actually have a specific amendment saying that everything that is not clearly outlined as a power of the federal government shall remain with the states is the guarantor of that. And the vast majority of discussions over education, health care, environment, and all of those other issues ultimately boils down to that. Should it be a matter of federal government that has the power? Is there anywhere in the Constitution where you can say that that's the case? Or is it a matter of states' rights? The vast majority of discussions of health care was about whether the federal government has a right to do so, to govern it, or whether it's a state right. So this amendment here is the source of much of the quibble, much of the discussion, much of the legal wrangling that has subsequently ensued. Because nearly every question that comes up in regards to policy ultimately has to be addressed as to whether or not it's the government, the federal government has a right to regulate it, or whether it's an issue for states and localities. And that's often also why the Supreme Court ends up deciding most of these contentious issues. Now, I have also said that there are not a lot of cases and names that I want you to be familiar with, but there are 3 cases in the Supreme Court history that you need to be familiar with because they've had such groundbreaking effect on how we govern ourselves and what we expect, things that we take for granted today. And what you have to read for week 8, I believe, on immigration, on health care, on structural reform, also pertains to this. First was in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison, where the Supreme Court said that there are limits of what the Congress can do. It can't act unconstitutionally and establish something called judicial review. In other words, the court said the Constitution is not just a base, it's not just a framework, it is a law. And we are a court. A court interprets law. Not just the laws passed by Congress, but the fundamental law. So we have the right to interpret what the Constitution says and what rights it gives Congress and gives others. So in 1803, we're looking 27 years past the Declaration of Independence. We're looking 16 years past the passing of a Constitution. The Supreme Court said, yes, the Constitution is a law. We're a court. We're going to interpret the Constitution as it pertains to laws passed by Congress. So then you had the judicial review set up. In 1819, in McCulloch versus Maryland, you had a decision that said the Congress' power is not just that which is explicitly stated in the Constitution, but also that which is implied by the Constitution. In other words, this is where you get the basis later on for saying that there are certain things that Congress and the President can do that are not specifically written out in the Constitution, but that are implied by the powers given to the President and the Congress. As Commander-in-Chief, it doesn't say in the Constitution that the Commander-in-Chief can send out troops anywhere in the world he wants at any point in time. But as Commander-in-Chief, he has that implied power. So this notion of implied power, this is the basis for the legitimate passing of income tax later on. Congress has to have the ability to carry out this in the Article 1, Section 8, that Congress has to be able to carry out its duties above and can pass any law that enables it to carry out the duties expressed in the Constitution. So implied powers is really, really, really important. Yes? 1819. And in 1824, a decision that was debated thousandfold in 2008, 2009, 2010 of the healthcare, something called the Commerce Clause, or the Interstate Commerce Clause. In 1824, in Gibbons v. Ogden, the Supreme Court said that it could regulate interstate commerce. In other words, commercial activity between two states. Now, the Supreme Court said that Congress can regulate that. And that means today that the powers of the federal government to regulate commerce, even that which you think on the face of it takes place within one state, is almost boundless. You could conjure up an image of an oak cabin up in the wilderness of Colorado, and you're growing your own food, you're serving only locals, you never venture off the state grounds, and the interstate commerce would 99% likelihood still apply. Because somewhere along the line, some piece of clothing or some piece of food or some piece of equipment had some component or some authorization that came from outside of your state, and voila, the federal government can regulate your entire enterprise because of interstate commerce. So it becomes a very technically difficult but incredibly encompassing right of the federal government. Because at some point, some component, some piece, some element of almost anything you touch, use, consume, or bear have crossed lines in the United States. And thus enables the federal government to regulate that under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And when we talk about healthcare, you'll see how that argument came up as well, about whether or not the federal government can regulate that. But we have set up a federal republic, a representative, constitutional-based system, which today we in layman's terms call democracy. If you want to be nitpicky about it, it's a republic, it's a representative republic. In other words, you elect people to represent you. But that's the case in every democracy in the world today. There's nowhere where every person has a little clicker on their cell phone and goes around, and instead of a national legislature, income tax reductions on S-level corporations, incomes between thus and that. Oh, vote. No, you have representatives that vote for you. So you don't have direct democracy anywhere. But we call it democracy because we elect the people that speak for us. So whether it's whether it's a republic, whether it's a unitary system, whether it's a constitutional monarchy or not. We have democracies with different systems set up. But in some way or form, you elect people that speak for you and take decisions for you. But the fact that we have a federalist system here, and we'll see in Canada and Germany, means that we have local government, city council. As I've said before, ESU students could run city council if they wanted to, and I have no doubt that that will ever happen. I mean, I have no doubt that that will not happen. But you have city, you have the county, you have the state, and then you have the national government. So you have multiple levels of governance. And there are advantages and disadvantages. But that's the federal system. You have between state, from the localities up. You also have separations at the national level, of course, between Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And this is really where the fight has taken place in the last, of all the major issues that have been debated over the last 10 years. There's very few issues where, where the judicial branch hasn't come in. The Supreme Court, particularly a guy named Anthony Kennedy on the Supreme Court, has really, really become the deciding vote in the United States. Most of the most contentious issues have been decided 5-4, and there's been one swing vote on there. So in many instances, you can say the most important person is not the Congress or the president, but a sole member of the Supreme Court. And for all our bashing of Congress and all our dislike of our elected officials that opinion polls bear out time and time again, two things stand out. Most people hate Congress because they think that some abstract notion body that doesn't do anything for them. But most people like their own congressperson because they think they work for them. And the support for the Supreme Court, even though it takes decisions that you may not agree with, has consistently remained high. Because it's seen as an impartial body that actually makes decisions that, even if you don't agree with it, actually acts as the true balancer between the partisan political bickering between the president and the legislature. The advantages, of course, of federalism that we may not always stop to think about is that you can really experiment to a very large extent. You can have a lot of differences, and if you've moved across the country, particularly between the most eastern and western states and north and south, you'll find a lot of differences. There are a lot of things that are banned or restricted or are regulated differently, for example, in California than in many other parts of the country.
California have their own thing on packaging.
In California, they have a lot of their own policies and old things. For two reasons. California, first of all, it's as large as many other countries, 35 million people, and it would be its 7th or 8th largest country in the world if it was its own sort of country. It also has something that we're not used to here, but then some other states have, namely the right of initiative, referendum, where if you get a certain percentage of, I think it's 2% of the registered voters, you can put anything on the ballot. And thus, you can actually govern the state's laws through the ballot box. So most Californians in March and November go, most years, to vote on ballots initiatives. Should energy companies be broken up? Should we raise taxes for schools? Should we erect a new lottery system, etc., etc.? The last referendum last November, they actually voted to increase their own taxes. Again, to designate specifically for schools. They've actually done so twice before, and both of the times those funds have then been ciphered off to other things. Yep. The argument this time was from the initiators that it would be ring-fenced, in other words, secure. But the larger point is here, it's an experimental feature of federalism that states have different ways in which they allow laws to be made. Nebraska has only one chamber. Every other state in the United States have a lower house and an upper house, aside from Nebraska. That's only one. They don't have parties in Nebraska, just individuals. Now they're debating whether to do away with that. So states can experiment of how they make laws as long as they respect federal laws. Federal laws always trump state laws if they conflict, and local laws. And they don't violate the Constitution, of course. And that, again, then can work its way through the legal system up to various appellate or Supreme Courts to rule on. But it also allows this enlarged amount of self-rule in states, protects, in many people's views, against an all-powerful federal government, because there's limits to what the federal government can do. There's limits to what the central power can do. If you compare that to, say, a country like England, one of our closest allies, there is nothing that stops the national government in England from doing anything it wants at any point in time on any issue. Absolutely nothing. But here we have clearly delineated powers from the federal to the state level and separations of powers that checks on the federal government. The White House has to agree with the legislature, and the courts can take on challenges to those decisions. Yes, sir?
Is California the only state that has that, where they can
No.
basically...
Many other states have referendums. Seattle, Washington State, Oregon, Colorado.
govern the states through the ballot?
Yes.
That's
There are
amazing.
a number of states that have it. You have legislators in all those states, and you have governors. But ballot initiatives are such that if a majority of people vote for the ballot becomes law, unless there is a legal challenge and the legal challenge shows that it's unconstitutional. And that, for example, happened on gay marriage. Then the court said first that they put an injunction on decision, and then it went through the system, and the court ultimately said, no, this is constitutional. So, yes, you can still challenge it in court,
Right.
but it overrides the legislative part. It overrides the legislators.
I wonder why all states don't have it to get more people to vote. I feel like that's an easy way.
Well, you're a smart group of men and women in here. Why would you not want initiatives in your state? Yes, sir.
To keep things the same, because most people don't want change. Because all those states that you named are considered the more forward-thinking,
Right.
more progress.
Yeah.
Things change there quicker. Like
Well,
in Colorado, they legalized marijuana, and most of those states probably have gay marriage. And the West Coast is much more different than the East Coast is in that matter.
I hear what you're saying, that they're more what you would call progressive. I do believe there's some conservatively leaning states that also have initiatives, although I don't recall them off the top of my head. But that's not if it's the case that this occurs only in states that are more left leaning, then their legislators would reflect that popular mood anyway. So maybe then initiatives wouldn't be needed. What would be another reason why you wouldn't, Phil?
I would say, given the general lack of interest from voters in voting, that a small percentage of the constituents of the state could run the whole state.
Okay, yes. Voter apathy means that a very small, energetic part of the population can thus get something on the ballot and succeed. That is a very, very good point.
But you always hear how our
Yeah.
age group isn't voting, but
Yes.
if you have that, maybe more of us would vote, so it wouldn't be just the...
Well, the
few
gentleman up
selected
here,
ones.
I can assure you, if you go and look at the voter turnout in referendums amongst the youth groups, you will find very little difference between voter turnout in referendums and voter turnouts in national elections. But think about this. In a democracy, you have the right to pose questions in any way, shape, or form you want. And if you write a initiative, because it has to be in one sentence, if you write a ballot initiative in a way that favors your idea, or in such a convoluted way that you include double negatives and contingencies in the one sentence, like what happened with electricity companies' breakups in California, you will ultimately either confuse people or you will try to get the answer you want for your specific idea, going back to the fact that you can mobilize people around your idea. So governors and legislators, particularly in Pennsylvania, where this issue has come up on a regular basis, have said we don't want it because it boils down to how you write the words and the question, how you write the statement, and you will just have another way of money influencing policy and gathering votes in addition to what we already have in the legislature. So there are pros and cons. There are people who are adamantly supportive of it, and states that have it do not want to go away with it. But there are a lot of governors and a lot of legislators in states that do not have the initiative that would really hate to have it. Yes, sir?
Doesn't the reason or excuse of how it's written kind of seems like petty? Like
Of course.
wrong?
How you write it, but
I think they're just afraid to give
you
power.
do not want to possibly see the breakup of two companies into one, which would then potentially increase or decrease your future electricity if this materializes in the next 20 years. Answer, yes or no?
You worded that weirdly.
Exactly.
I have a question.
No.
I have a question about that.
No, I'm purposely being vague because that is very close to the electricity breakup. Sorry, go ahead.
Why is it even an option to vote on a business decision like electricity?
Because the government in the state regulate land allocation and permits for construction, and in order to generate electricity, you have to have construction either for generation or distribution of energy. And another thing to remember in the United States when it comes to states in experiments, some states like Pennsylvania have less than 1% federally owned land. The rest is owned by states, by the state, by localities, by individuals. In Nevada, 86% of the territory of the state of Nevada is owned by the federal government. So they have very, very limited ability to do anything. Utah, I think it's around 60 or 70%. So again, it also depends on where your state is located and whether you have access to land, how much you can experiment with things like things that require permits and construction. It also is meant to, one of the arguments by founding fathers, articulated also in the Federalist Papers, most adamantly by Hamilton and John Jay, is that federalism is supposed to get people engaged. Because government is closer to you, you're supposed to be more engaged, more enthusiastic, more interested. In theory, that's how federalism is supposed to work. Many people will say in reality it's worked out a little less so. While you have active, engaged citizen groups, volunteer groups in the communities, and some of you may also be participating in such, turnout in elections is less the more local they get, and higher the more national they get. So it's the complete opposite. More power is local, fewer people turn out to vote. Less power is federal, more people turn out to vote. There are a lot of speculation as to why that is. It's easier to keep track of one person or two candidates than keep track of every judge and dog chaser and school board member and who knows what that we vote on continuously at the local level. And I'll be the first to go on that record. I don't know every candidate that's on local elections. It's just impossible to keep track of. It's supposed to be an exercise in representative government, but there are arguments on both sides about whether or not there's actually increased quality of local government or decreased it. And you're also supposed to innovate. California's tried a lot of things that other states haven't tried. From carbon emissions trading, what pollutants companies can let out, to various other reforms. Other states have tried other things. New York and gambling and charter schools. States are allowed to innovate with their own policy initiatives and own attempts and trials that if they work, other states will then adapt. If they don't, oh good, we just tried it in one area. An example of where this actually did work was, I think it was Wisconsin that tried this welfare policy where you limited welfare eligibility to 5 years in your life, throughout your working life, and that then became national policy. So sometimes it works, and others start adopting it, even becomes national policy. Sometimes it doesn't work, and nobody else wants a part of it. And thus you haven't ruined, quote unquote, the entire country through an experiment that turned out not to be what you hoped for. So policy innovation is another reason for it. Now, back when our Constitution was written, you may have thought 2 years is a long time in office for a member of House of Representatives. 2 years, you can get things done, you can talk, you can debate, you can put bills. Today, 2 years is very, very, very short. Every other November, we have elections to the House of Representatives. Every other November, we go to the polls to vote for our region's representatives to the House. That means they start campaigning in January, February. And they're not seated until January the following year. So you have about 13 months on which you focus solely on legislation as it's supposed to be, supposedly. But within those months, as long as you're in Washington, you also have to raise a lot of money. Because everyone in this room and everyone else wants to hear what the candidates say. And none of us are going to go to his homepage and read through every policy proposal they have. So, 30-second sound bites on TV and the internet and radio are what they need money for, as well as stump speeches and other campaign activities. So money raising takes up a large percentage of elected officials' lives. So this 2-year term that was supposed to hold people very accountable, because members of the House are the ones that are closest to you and me. They're the smallest constituency of all national legislators. They're supposed to be close to the people, know what's going on, accountable. 2 years was a good term. It was thought to hold people accountable. But that has turned out to be a very, very short period of time. And it is very little that you can get done in 2 years' time, according to most people that have been elected. And it's also why you and our fellow citizens across the country re-elect about 87% of all incumbents. And it's why it's so difficult to challenge, particularly House members, right off the bat, because 2 years, we'll give them another chance, and 2 years to 2 years. Despite Congress having an 8% approval rating consistently in the last 2 years, individual members are, we like them. They're good. And 2 years is a very difficult time to get to know a very complicated, very dense national legislature. Take 4 years to get a bachelor's, 2 years to learn how Congress works and all the rules and get to know people and get on committees. It's a very, very short period of time. But, of course, our compromise here was that you can have a lot of them from the larger states, from the populous states. So the smallest states, what's the least amount, the smallest number, of members of the House that a state can have? In the House, what's the least amount of representatives that a state can have? One, yes. Because no state is allowed to have less than one. Technically, states like Wisconsin and Alaska should have like 0.3, according to the population. But you have to have one at minimum. And 2 are in the Senate. But this was a compromise, of course, to allow proportionality. This is where we have proportional representation in the United States. That the larger states have the most members of Congress, the smaller states have the least. And so California has 54, I believe, and Wyoming has 1, Alaska has 1. Okay, we'll continue next time.